So for those of you who weren't here last week, I guess there's a hint in that there's a part 2 on the slide, that this is part 2 of talking about some lessons from Lighthouse, which was sparked from a couple of sermons talking about just coping with life when it can seem overwhelming, and then how it is that we as followers of Jesus can become what Jesus becomes for each of us. And we looked at Psalm 18, where it talked about, I love you, O Lord, my strength. O Lord, my rock, my fortress and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield, my salvation, my stronghold. And that when the torrents of destruction overwhelm us, and in our distress we call to the Lord, he hears our cry and saves us. And later in that same psalm, we find the psalmist declaring this about God: you, O Lord, keep my lamp burning. My God, you turn my darkness into light. And this idea of God being for us our strength, our salvation, a rock who secures us, who keeps us safe, and turning our darkness into light, all made me think of the different metaphors that would come from talking about a lighthouse. And I'm fascinated because I think there's not just one lesson that we can learn from a lighthouse, there's a few. Last week in particular, I talked about how after a while of making a lot of lighthouses that didn't really last very well, they came up with some designs that mimicked an oak tree in the broad base and the curve going up, which allowed the wave force to be dissipated, and how the construction was done in a way where all the stones were cut to dovetail in with one another, not just in each layer, but between layers. And so where the force of a storm might move one rock, even a rock of 2, 3, 4, 5 tons, the waves could move when all those stones were locked together. The strength of each one on their own would not be enough, but the strength of all together was enough. Yet there were challenges in building those lighthouses, but they took those challenges as something worth facing because of the purpose they had in mind: to save others, to show a light that would be a beacon, to show where there were hazards, and to help guide the ships safely to their destinations. And as a lighthouse stands tall and high to shine out that light, the question is, do we as individuals do that? And do we take the same effort to build in our lives and our churches a foundation and a building and a light that is as effective as some that have been built in history? That our light would shine before men in such a way that they would see our good works and glorify our Father who is in heaven. As I said, one clear purpose for showing a light, and I'll come to the other purpose at the end of my sermon as well, is to warn of the hazards upon which ships were wrecked. And when there were no lighthouses in some places, or very few, there were often, just terrible tragedies and losses of life. That's an engraving of the sinking of the Lockard. Some of you may have been down on the Great Ocean Road and been to Lockard Gorge, where, the 2 survivors, a young woman and a lower deck hand, and some people romantically thought, the 2 survivors, they should marry. But sadly, in that time, the difference in social status, etc., was too much. They needed some more romantic novel writers, perhaps. And so that didn't happen. But the tragedy was all those lives that were lost. And I talked last week about one particular reef that was causing at least 6, if not more, fatal shipwrecks every winter, and sometimes in particularly bad storms, many more. And in the region of where that was, either from running into it or avoiding running into it and running into other things, in one storm, 70 ships were lost. A place called Bell Rock off the east coast of Scotland. And I talked a little bit about that and the family of engineers, a particular guy who oversaw the construction and the design of that lighthouse. There was another guy called John Rennie, but Stevenson, and this whole generation, whole descendants of this guy took on the family business and built many, many lighthouses around Scotland. And there's a fascinating book, which a few people have already said, can they borrow? I'll have to dig it off my bookshelf somewhere. I think I bought 2 copies of it once so I could lend one out. But if you notice on the cover of that, it actually talks about these people being the ancestors of Robert Louis Stevenson, who you have perhaps heard of. If you've never heard of the Lighthouse Stevensons, you've probably heard of him. Famous for a couple of books in particular, Treasure Island and Kidnapped. Who's read or seen movies about those? Both of which involve ships or shipwrecks. And in one of those, actually in Kidnapped, he references a particular reef, the Torren Rocks off the west coast of Scotland. The Black Teeth of Death, the Torren Rocks. And in one particular storm, the end of December 1865, 24 vessels were lost in the area of these rocks in this one storm. Writer at the time described them as being scattered over a wide area like dragon's teeth, lurking menacingly just beneath the surface, occasionally showing themselves in a froth of white spittle. And Robert Louis Stevenson could write about those because he knew about them quite well, because his father, Tom Stevenson, is the person who eventually built a lighthouse there on those rocks. Du Bartach, which is probably not how you would pronounce it, but the Black One of Death in one of the Celtic languages. And the story of Bell Rock is amazing. The story of this is quite amazing as well. And it's in the book. But before talking about some of the other lighthouses that this particular family built, I want to talk about the first lighthouse that was built in these particularly difficult situations of an offshore rock. They built lighthouses, on the shore at different places to help people, know that perhaps, there were some dangerous points there, or that was the region where there might be some dangerous things. But to actually put a light on the reef itself when that was miles and miles and miles out to sea, out of sight of all land. And there's one particular rock called the Eddystone, I guess because there was an eddy of water that was around it, and it's off Cornwall in the south of England. And it protrudes about 3 feet above at high tide, and when the tide goes down, you see more of it, and there's great long ridges. And it was so bad that in the 1500s, 1600s, people were trying to avoid it so much that they stayed so far away that they ended up running into the French coast instead. So it didn't really help. You'll notice in the picture there a stump of an older lighthouse in the picture. And that was the previous one that got dismantled, not because there was anything wrong with that lighthouse, actually, but the rock on which it was built had started to crack. The waves were so severe. So they took that lighthouse away, and actually they re-erected it, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. But there were 5 different lighthouses built eventually on this particular rock. And the first one in 1697, a man named Winstanley went out and started building a wooden structure to hold a light. And England and France were involved in a bit of a skirmishy war thing at that time. And in 1697, a French vessel took this guy Winstanley as a prisoner. It took him back, and when Louis XIV heard of that, he ordered him to be released, saying, we're at war with England, not at humanity, let him build his lighthouse, which was amazing. The first tower was destroyed almost as soon as it was built, but they built a second one, which was, quite fancy looking, very, very pretty, a big flag and bells and a bit ornate and inscribed with things. But it really only lasted about 7 or 8 years before a storm wiped it away. And sadly, Winstanley was there at the time overseeing some alterations, and he and some others were never seen again. So another man named Rudyard then built another lighthouse that was wood but clad with stone. And it lasted almost 50 years. But as I said, it had a lot of wood in it. And the light at the top, which was just 24 candles, I'll come and talk about that again a bit later. Sadly, at one stage, a spark from the candles lit something which caught fire in the wood, and eventually all of it burnt down. And so an engineer named John Smeaton came to build one from stone, and you know, the interlocking that they started to do and designed and so on. And it lasted so long. There's a drawing of it there, and there's a picture from the 1800s of it there. Must be fairly early 1800s or mid-1800s, because I can't remember exactly when they took it away, but they dismantled it and erected it on the foreshore at Plymouth. And I've been and seen that there. But then eventually there was one last lighthouse built, and it's the one that's still there now, well over 100 years later. And again, is this just interesting history, Chris, or is there some point to this? Well, I think there are lessons we can learn from these kind of things. And one in particular is that though some lessons, or some efforts in mission are difficult, it's certainly worth persevering. And just because we fail, just because what we've done, a storm comes and it seems to collapse, we don't just disappear off and say, well, we tried, that's it. That we might say, well, let's build again. Maybe let's learn and do it a bit differently, but let's build again. Let's finish this because we believe it to be worthwhile. And they did this again and again. There's another rock which is even further out to sea than the Eddystone one, called Bishop Rock. And there was a guy who wanted to make that in the 1850s, or in the early, about 1850. And he decided he'd use this, wonderful stuff, iron that they had, and they drilled some stuff in the rock, and they built these iron scaffolding and struts, and they put the tower on the top. And the only thing that remained was for them to come out and actually put the light and the thing that allowed the light to shine and return when a storm came and tore the whole thing down. But they began again. This time they did the more traditional building it all from stone bit. And so the other one you see in the photo there was finished in 1858 and has stood ever since. Perseverance. Persistence. Back to the Stevenson family. Another significant engineering achievement was a lighthouse again on the west part of Scotland, Bells Rocks on the east, at a place that was known as Skerryvore. And you might remember last week I talked about, the cost being involved, and sometimes people not being willing to pay the cost. And sadly, it wasn't really the loss of life, but the loss of business and money that perhaps caused some of the people in the end to decide to fund the building of this lighthouse. But that there is a cost for us to build our lives and to build the church. And are we willing to spend that? And the Lighthouse Commission didn't like the fact that it was going to cost at least £63,000. I should have looked at one of those things to work out how much money that was in the early 1800s. Would have been an awful lot of money. They set up a committee to discuss the idea. Eventually, in 1835, they all took a trip out to have a look for themselves where this would be. And said during the trip, their steamer lost the rivets of the boiler just off Skerryvore itself, and a fire broke out in the boiler room, crippling the ship. Though the fire was eventually extinguished, the experience concentrated the minds of the commissioners wonderfully. Being stuck on a disabled ship just off the most dangerous rocks in Scotland was, they decided, a remarkably persuasive argument for a lighthouse to be built there, whatever the expense. So they did. But again, it's just astonishing and astounding. But Alan Stevenson, the son of the guy who built the Bell Rock, landed on the rock in 1838 to begin to build. And, they didn't have very long. They'd get out there at 4 a.m. and they'd work through to 8 p.m. just for the short few days in each season, really, that they were able to build this. And they, built a barracks for them to live in before they could build the rest of it. And they did that, and they went off, and they came back the next season, and the barracks was completely gone. So they had to sort of start again from scratch. And they, sort of went back and did that again. But they persisted and continued to persist. And, they felt at this place, I think at Bell Rock, they couldn't use dynamite for some reason. They felt they could use some blasting powder here, but because it was such a tiny rock, there was nowhere for them to go when they did that. So they would dig the hole, put the blasting powder in, they'd put nets over the hole, and they'd all wear fencing masks, and huddle somewhere and wait for the thing to blow up. And apparently they only needed to dig 15 inches down, but they could only, strike with the pick 3 or 4 times before they had to go back and sharpen it again. But they persisted. They continued. A lesson from the lighthouse builders is to be persistent, because what is being built brings salvation, brings safety, brings guidance, brings direction. The other important thing to know about building these lighthouses is to make sure that it's right for the local conditions. And those conditions might be all manner of things. I've got to talk about this one just because I love the name of it. There's this lighthouse again built by the Stevenson family called Muckle Flugger. And these rocks were 200 feet above the sea level. And so they thought it was 200 feet above the sea level. We don't have to make it to withstand the waves like the other ones. It's just got to cope with the wind and the rain. However, when the winter gales began to break over the rock, it found the sea actually broke over the 200-foot high, standing out of the ocean. In one time they talked about the keeper had found that 40 feet of stone dike had been knocked down, all the water casks had been washed away, and huge stones shifted and moved. It's kind of interesting. You see there where the ones I've talked about already are. This Muckle Flugger one is right at the very top. The Orkneys. Right on the top. But amazing, as I said, you'd sort of think that 200 feet above, the waves aren't going to. But the waves would break, rush up 200 feet of sloping ground and still have enough force to break down rock walls and to shift stones. So they decided they better, make sure that what they made suited the local conditions. So they made a taller tower and a stronger tower than they had originally planned. But while that one, they had to make it higher to, resist the waves, there's another one that was built not by the Stevensons, but down off the Isle of Wight. There's this dangerous outcrop known as the Needles, and they had a lighthouse up on the mainland on the hill, a great, terrific lighthouse. Shine the light, could see it for miles on a clear day. In a storm, most of the time, you couldn't see it because it was so high, it was above the clouds and the fog and the storm. So eventually they realised that was no good, and they strived to build a lighthouse down on the Needles themselves, where it was needed. Again, a lesson for us. The lighthouse that we want to be or build as a church. Are we somewhere where we think, yes, we're showing out this light, it's great, but in the real storms and difficulties, can those who need to see it really see? Or do we perhaps need to be in a different place? And then, of course, there's so many lessons that we can learn from the light itself. As I said, to start with, back in the mid-1700s or whatever, 24 candles. When they built the Bell Rock, it was candles, a bunch of candles. But then, in darkness, you can see a small light a long way away. It might not be particularly bright, but it was better than nothing. Amazing. So one of the other things the Stevenson family did was introduce not just candles, but these argand lamps, not argon, argand, A-R-G-A-N-D, where someone had discovered a way of making the flame be brighter, in a way to fan into flame that which was there, by causing convection currents, the air to bring oxygen that would increase the combustion, and the wick and the fuel would burn more efficiently and burn more brightly. And again, for us, the lessons we can learn from the light is to make sure that we fan into flame the gifts of God which are within us, to invite the Holy Spirit in such a way to be breathing upon us and around us that we are oxygenated and energized. And that we would have a light that would shine brighter and better. And as he said, he has, the reflectors there. But one of the other things, eventually under one of this guy's descendants, under Tom Stevenson, who was the father of Robert Louis Stevenson, they eventually reached 1 million candle power, compared to like the 24 candle power of the 24 actual candles. So, within 60 or 70 years. And one of the other ways they did that was to help focus the light better, not just by having a reflector behind it, but by what they would use as the lens in front. And you may have seen or heard of these lenses, a Fresnel lens, Fresnel when you see it written down, F-R-E-S-N-E-L. If you've got one of those flat sheets that you use to magnify a book page, it's often like that. A lens would be quite big with a curve on it and big and heavy, but if you take that curve and you sort of chop it up into little lines and then take out the bits that are underneath and lower the curve bit down, you kind of get all the curve of the lens in a flat, smaller area. Now, it won't focus things as well so you can get a sharp image to read it and see it type of thing as a camera lens or another magnifying glass, but it will still, help to direct and magnify and collimate, as they would say, that light. And so introducing these lenses and more improvements, having fanned it into flame to get a brighter, more efficient light, having focused the light in a way that means that it's not just wasted off, but concentrated. And so for us, in our own individual lives and calling, what areas of focus, perhaps, does God want us to, be reminded of that might intensify and brighten the lights that we shine? And then one of the other important things about the light is the fuel. And I thought, I wonder if there's any image anywhere of fuel being delivered to a lighthouse. And I found this. I loved it. It's actually a company in Maine, and their logo is a lighthouse with their fuel truck coming to deliver. Isn't that great? I've emailed them and asked them, could I use their picture? And I didn't hear back before the service, so I hope they're going to say yes. If they're not, well, I'll have to deal with that. But I think that's great. But we know the story of the wise and foolish virgins, as it talks about it in the Bible, where some, they had their lamps and they want to keep their lamps going, but some, they went out with their lamps and they just took the lamp without any extra oil, and as their oil was running out, their lamps died. But the wise had taken not just their lamps, but taken oil in their jars along with their lamps to be able to have oil in their lamps. Who remembers that old song? Give me oil in my lamp, keep me burning. The light needs to be fueled. We need to be fueled and refueled. Fan into flame, remain focused. Find the fuel for our lives. But I said the other purpose in a light is not just to shine out to warn of hazards and dangers. It's actually an aid to navigation in general. And so we can learn a lesson here that both for us as we find, Jesus to be our lighthouse, but as we are being built into, something that he would use to help others, there's also the call for us of helping to navigate others' journey through life. And this is kind of a fascinating little image there. Somebody's taken it and mapped out a whole heap of lighthouses around the world, and the colour of the lighthouse and its flashing pattern. I mean, if you zoom in, it's you can tell more differences. But beacon buoys and lighthouses, there'll be different colours and different flashing patterns. So when it comes out, it's not just there's a lighthouse, maybe there's some danger there. It's, that's Cape Schanck, that's, Apollo Bay, that's the Scary Vore. The signature's not just a warning for hazards, it's an aid to navigation. Not just about danger, but about the journey. And they're still valuable today. There's a documentary which I might email out a link to, a little BBC short documentary talking about lighthouses in general. And at the end of it, the guy's on it and he's talking about being on a fairly big ferry full of passengers going somewhere and up on the bridge and talking to the captain and asking, do you actually use these lighthouses and things anymore? And the captain said, good heavens, yes. And he pointed to his GPS equipment and said, the GPS tells me where it thinks I am. Your car can do that sometimes. But he said, looking at that lighthouse over there tells me where I know I am. And in those circumstances where the weather's bad and the visibility is bad, I can have the confidence of knowing where I am from those traditional aids. So the idea that it would guide us. In the rules for lighthouse keeping on the Bell Rock, one of the things it said, and lighthouse keeping is not lighthouse keeping as the lazy, cleaning lady was after, light housekeeping, but lighthouse keeping, said the keepers of the Bell Rock Lighthouse are instructed and directed to keep the lamps of the reflecting apparatus burning bright and clear from the going away of daylight till the return of daylight. The better to obtain this purpose, the period of night is divided into watches, and each keeper will mount guard for 3 hours. One of the other things I didn't say was they learnt very early on that while this might seem a solitary pursuit, you didn't just put one person out there. And you didn't just put 2 people out there, because they did that once and somebody died, and the other guy really didn't know what to do, and eventually the boat came and he'd kept the light burning, but the poor other guy had gone a bit insane in the meantime. So after that, they decided they needed to have 3 people at least there at all times. But one of the other lessons we can learn is not to do these things alone, but divided into watch with each keeper mounting guards. The fountains of the lamps to be supplied daily with oil, the wicks frequently trimmed. And the motion of the machinery must be so regulated that one of the lights of the natural appearance and one of the lights coloured red would be exhibited to the manner in the most brilliant effect in the course of each 4 minutes. And the reflector frame makes one entire revolution in 8 minutes. It flashed a colour. We learn so much from this. It's there to flash a light. You don't do it alone. You trim the wick so that it's got the air around it properly. You make sure the fuel is up. And it has a characteristic, not just to warm, but to help people to navigate on their way. Because the Bible tells us that God will instruct and teach us in the way that we should go. And as we follow Christ, we, like Paul would say, follow me as I follow Christ. If we want others perhaps follow Christ, but they only see us, let us be living in such a way that we are an appropriate navigational aid for them in their lives. So with lighthouses, there are certainly many different styles and many different positions, but they do all have this dual purpose. And just the same as Christians are of very many, types and styles and personalities, and so other, gatherings that we have as churches. But we are here for a purpose, that our light would shine before men, that they would see our good deeds and glorify our Father in heaven, that they would find protection from the hazards of life, and that they would find direction on their journey. And these family of Stevensons, besides being lighthouse builders, were all people of faith, provoked to do the good works of lighthouse building because they did genuinely care about the souls, the lives, the ones that would be lost. And those lighthouses that they built are all still there. None of them have, been washed away after they've been completed. They still serve their purpose. Things have been modernised and updated. You saw some of them had a flat thing on top so a helicopter could, land there, etc. But they're still around. Perhaps one reason is because they were people of faith. And this was one of his prayers at the founding of this Bell Rock Lighthouse. Prosper, we beseech thee, the work itself in which we are engaged. May it remain long after our eyes have ceased to behold it. Long after our ashes are cold in the dust. May he that was ready to perish have cause to bless the memory of those by whom it was reared.